Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Real Estate Outlook 2022 that's hosted by Fine and Country. I just call at this point on Mr. Patola to just give his own insights as well, and then we can get into the questions. We have quite a number of questions. You have a very active audience here. So, Mr. Patola, over to you.
All right. Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. So, just a quick overview 2021. So the real estate market, I would say, had picked up 2021. We saw quarter four expected to deliver of 2021, deliver strong growth, even near full recovery. We also noticed that in the residential space in 2021, especially the high-end luxury, we noticed that the market really picked up. If I want to speak from a tenant's standpoint, I would say that there've been a lot of takers for so many of those super luxury developments. For instance, number 4, Bodilon residential developments. And I can gladly even say that they have a waiting list of prospective tenants. So the demand is there from that perspective. And if I have to speak to commercial, I can confidently also say that in the commercial space, there've been oversupply. And where it comes oversupply, you see that a lot of these companies were just recycling a lot of these corporates. So they leave one of these buildings, maybe a grade B building or a grade C, and they end up taking another building that is a bit newer. So hardly are we seeing new takes in the commercial space. If I need to speak to trends to watch in the space, I would like to say that definitely there will be some population of real estate players. We know what happened with the Ikoyi building collapse. So we know that Lagos State is coming in strong in terms of regulation in that space. And there will be a lot more restriction to what developers build. When you speak about luxury real estate, especially residential, you see that most people look at the location, they look at the exclusivity. But now emphasis will be laid on the quality of those developers, especially where regulation is to come into place. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Mr. Patola. And I think you also just emphasized the point around quality. But I like the point you made as well on increased regulation. And hopefully in the next panel, we'll focus on that. On the heels of the series of building collapse, notably the recent Ikoyi luxury apartment, which you also spoke about, what do you say to weak enforcement or the lukewarm approach by regulatory authorities in the industry? The second part of that question is, what are we likely to see that will instill confidence in the industry?
Thank you very much. So from the regulatory standpoint, I can say a lot has been done already immediately after the aftermath of the Ikoyi building collapse. Right now, they'll be issuing stage development certificates, right from LABCA, if I'm not mistaken. So for every stage, Lagos State officials will come and certify that stage satisfactory before you move to the next level. I also noticed that towards the tail end of last year, authorities from Lagos State also were going on enforcement drive towards the Lekki-Ajah axis. So you can see that they're taking steps in the right direction. It's also key to note that Lagos State cannot do it all. So we're also employing developers and investors to be mindful. So yes, you want to make all the profits, but still have behind the back of your mind that, look, these are people's lives, these are people's investments. From the information that I have, that building that collapsed, there was no insurance in place. So I'm wondering what will happen to the subscribers, what will happen to people's funds and things like that. It's a tough situation we find ourselves, but with every situation, there are also opportunities.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Patola. And just riding on the back of that as well, in the absence of all of those very important quality checks, including the insurance, the values of those properties were still so high. So there's a question here about what's actually shooting up, the valuation, what's driving the price value so quickly in the market. Land values, for instance, in Ikoyi and Banana are shooting up, yet there is no marked change in the economy. And then if we look at that point around, the quality checks as well, there seems to be no control. They're all just going up.
Yeah, thank you. Let me answer the question in twofold. One, as Mrs. Okonjo said, quality of build. I can tell you when I do tenant representation, we have very few. So the last survey we did in our firm, we found out that a typical client looking for a nice 3 or 4 bedroom residential accommodation, they have to view between 15 to 25 apartments before they see the one they like. So you see a lot of highly priced apartments, but they're not worth that price. That's on one hand. On the other hand, most landlords that reduce their expectation gradually. So when the economy is dull, you have your apartment priced highly. If you don't get any takers, gradually you tend to reduce your expectation in terms of the rental. When you reduce your expectation, then it's likely you get takers. Sorry, can you mention the second part of that question again?
It's just asking why the values are increasing drastically, even though
yes,
there's
correct.
no change.
Yes, then as regards, so it's a function of demand supply. On my last count, we have less than 10 authentic residential plots in Banana Island available for sale. I've not done a survey of that in Ikoyi, but I can guess there are more buyers looking for those type of very few limited lands. So economics will play. They tend to increase when you see a lot of buyers chasing very few products. That's on one hand. Two is if it's priced high and there are takers, obviously there's demand for it, and that's the going rate. Because if you look at valuation is the value that a willing buyer and willing seller will be able to agree. If you don't agree, like I mentioned earlier, those figures would tend to drop. So there's huge demand, prices are going up. Yes, it's not reflective of the economy, but this is an exclusive market. It's not for everybody, and definitely the market is there and the demand is there. So there's no surprise for me.
Yeah, I guess it's just also a call for takers to do their due diligence, right? Because I see a point as well in the comments section where someone is saying even if there was insurance, it's highly unlikely that a claim would be valid if regulations were not adhered to. So very, very important point there. Give recommendations that I'm sure our listeners would thoroughly appreciate. Recommendations to investors and also intending property purchasers.
Okay, thank you. So for me, I would like investors to just think out of the box. The market is exciting on both segments, whether commercial, whether high-end luxury residential. And I was sharing with a colleague a couple of days ago, and he was telling me that so those typical New York skyscrapers, so there's a challenge, back in the days, you would say the higher you go, you have fantastic views of New York or Manhattan. So the higher you go, the more pricey per square foot or per square meter. But because of the pandemic, things have changed quite a bit. So now people don't want to be crammed in lifts, to have to go higher up. So now a lot of those skyscrapers, they lower the floors, the more pricey. People don't want to go higher up for those kind of office spaces. So we also need to be radical in our thinking. I've seen commercial spaces where landlords are giving fantastic incentives. They don't want vacancy ratios in their buildings to be high. You know what the cost will be in terms of service charge. So the more creative they are in their thinking, the faster they can get their commercial spaces leased up. We've seen a lot of demand springing up in the co-working and remote working space. Yes, we know that a lot of these offices, they prefer the off-site locations, but gradually we're coming back to normalcy. So we need to see a lot more creativity in terms of pricing, in terms of remodeling of the large office spaces into smaller units, because that's where the demand is, in those smaller units. Thank you.
One question that came to mind for me while Mrs. O was talking about the 3 C's on collaboration, creativity, and credibility. And then also when Mr. Ojo spoke to value, and then we looked at the regulations and all of that, the watchword for me at that point was sustainability. And we're seeing a lot of rise in ESG concerns now, where a lot more investors are pushing funds to projects that are sustainable. And that is also attracting a new segment of the market, which are the millennials. And what we've also seen is an increase in share value for companies that actively have ESG as part of their risk frameworks, and also infuse that in the products that they bring to market. So from the standpoint of all of the skyscrapers, I know in Africa we don't emit so much carbon, but we're right now at the peak in nature where a lot of action is now being taken to cure what had been done by other countries that had emitted all of this carbon, and we can't be left out, unfortunately. So as we build all the skyscrapers, how are we thinking about the emission of carbon? What are some of those creative ideas as well that can be brought into real estate, and also attract the right investment, but also start to capture more value in that space? I'd like to hear a few thoughts on that, perhaps from any of the speakers on the panel.
Okay, let me just jump right in. So I know the COP26 conference on climate change last year spoke extensively on that. I'm happy you mentioned it, because buildings generally, whether a skyscraper or not, emit globally at least 30-40% to carbon footprint. So some of the strategies that are even being deployed in this part of the world in terms of environmental sustainability. So adoption of PropTech. We've seen smart buildings where the last person to leave the office floor, irrespective of whether you switch off the lights or not, they are motion censored. So the lights go off automatically. We've seen even sustainability in terms of design. So architects are jumping on board in that regard. We've seen even the raw materials, developers being more responsible in the raw materials that they're using, building materials to develop some of these high-tech buildings, whether commercial or residential. Then we've seen in terms of engagements. So for instance, enriching webinars like this, we've seen articles. So people are jumping on board that train much more. Thank you.